Yo guys, Punkrat with another video. So, classic raids tend to have the reputation of being relatively simple in their design. In a lot of ways, this is true, especially in comparison to the level of design that we see in the modern game mechanics-wise. Although, it's not necessarily true for absolutely every case. A lot of the modern raid mechanics that we see today across a lot of different games were actually inspired from some of the more interesting fights in vanilla. In this video, I'm going to cover some of the most interesting and unique raid boss encounters in classic WoW. First on the list, we've got Jin'do the Hexer from Zul'Gurub. So if you guys played back in the day, you could have ran Zul'Gurub maybe 50 different times and never even attempted or downed Jin'do. Back in those days, especially for random ZG pugs, Jin'do was commonly just skipped over because pugs found him way too difficult. And I mean, pugs aren't exactly the best environment to wipe in progress on a boss due to people, not necessarily feeling loyalty to that raid group. People leave pugs at the first sign of wasted time. That's not a new thing in the modern game. That's been happening since forever. Jin'do was a really interesting boss encounter. He had multiple mechanics that were far more complex than what the general vanilla player base was used to at the time. First off, he had two totems that he would drop which would need to be killed immediately. A brainwash totem, which was a mind control totem that would MC a random raid member, and next a powerful healing ward totem that would heal him for 3% of his max HP per tick. He also had this teleportation ability where he would teleport a random raid member into a skeleton pit, so the AoE team would have to immediately go there and help that person and mow down all the skeletons as quickly as possible with their AoE spells. He also had a polymorph ability called Jin'do's Hex, which he would cast on the target with the most threat on him, which was generally the main tank of course, and in the process the main tank would lose threat, and he would switch to the second highest target. This could easily make things messy. Luckily though, the Hex was dispellable, so a quick dispel was also super important. He also had Delusions of Jin'do, which was a curse that he would apply to a random raid member which would allow them to see Shades of Jin'do, which were shadow spirits that he would spawn periodically throughout the fight. The person who had the curse on them had the job of keeping up with killing the Shades. You can see how this fight was pretty complex for the time, with a bunch of mechanics requiring a decent amount of reaction time to answer quickly, which is why the fight was a pug killer. Next on the list, we've got, and some of you guys may not like this one, but I'm still putting it on the list, Baron Geddon, the fire elemental boss from Molten Core. Baron had three mechanics. The first one was Inferno, which was a hellfire of sorts, a fire pulse around himself that would deal damage to anyone in a 15-yard or so range every second for 1 second. So melee just had to run out for the Inferno and then come back in as it finished. The tank stayed put and you healed him through it. Next, he had Ignite Mana, which was a debuff that he applied raid-wide, literally onto all 40 members within the raid. It was a damage over time debuff that would drain 400 mana. So if this debuff was left to do its thing, it would basically drain the entire raid's mana pool. Paladins and priests used to just dispel all fight. The next mechanic, which is the reason why I put this guy on the list, was Living Bomb, a raid mechanic which we still see very often to this day on different boss fights. He would put a Living Bomb debuff on a random raid member, and that raid member would have to basically evacuate the immediate area or cause a wipe. What was so funny about this ability was early on, before it got patched, the debuff would potentially target pets within the raid. So if a warlock had a fell hunter, for example, it would get targeted by the bomb, and the warlock was actually able to dismiss his pet, then go to Ironforge in the auction house where there's a cluster of unsuspecting victims, resummon the pet with the debuff still applied and ticking, and wipe the whole auction house out like an atom bomb. Brutal but hilarious, and a moment in WoW history that sticks with many of us vanilla veterans still to this day. Next, we got Razorgore, the first boss in Blackwing Lair. This fight, alongside with Veilstraz the Corrupt, the second boss in Blackwing Lair, were the first official guild breakers in classic WoW. These fights broke people. Razorgore is a really interesting fight. So there's this mind control orb that's on one side of the room, and Razorgore stands on the opposing side. The tactic is to have a dedicated controller click the orb and take control of Razorgore for the first phase of the fight. That person will have two jobs: breaking the eggs that are scattered throughout the entire room, and using the hibernate spell on dragonkins that are spawning. During this entire phase, the room is going to be rushed from all four corners of the boss room by orcs and dragonkins alike. Back in the good old days of vanilla, people were so poorly itemized and poorly specced and rarely had consumables. This meant that for most guilds it was basically impossible to actually kill the ads faster than they were being spawned. I know because I was in one of those shitty guilds. The alternate strategy was so bad, but it kind of got the job done, funnily enough. We used to literally go around gathering all of the ads in the boss room and endlessly kite them around the entire perimeter of the room, endlessly just looping around the boss room. As we would kite them, paladins would lay down consecrates on the ground, hunters immolation traps, collapse, mages would flame strike, to scorch the earth, cone of cold, things like that, and we would slowly just kite them around the entire perimeter and slowly just wear them down. Hunters were the main kiters here, using distracting shot at every mob that they could and just endlessly running around in circles around the room. It was a complete cluster, a complete mess. Once the mind controller would break all of the eggs, all of the adds would then flee the room, so you didn't even have to kill them anymore, and the boss would become engaged. It was a pretty simple boss fight from then on. I mean, the main tank would get conflagged about every 30 seconds, the off tank would then pick it up, and the boss would cast a fireball volley that can be line of sighted every time it goes off, so whenever he casts it, you just run around the pillar and then rinse and repeat. Next up, and staying in Blackwing Lair, is the Suppression Room / Broodlord Lash Lair. The Suppression Room is a gauntlet, but it's basically attached to the Broodlord fight in a certain way, which is why I put them together on the list as one fight. If you wipe on Broodlord, you have to redo the entire Suppression gauntlet, no questions asked. The Suppression Room is a 2-floor gauntlet event that has these pylons scattered all over the place, with tons of adds as well on top of that. If you're in range of a suppression pylon, your cast time is reduced by 80%. Your attack speed is reduced by 400% and movement speed again by 80%. So you're basically useless if you're within that range. Rogues can disarm the traps, however, while in stealth, using disarm trap with their thieves tools. You need to make your way through the entire room. Rogues ahead disabling traps, hunters pulling the elite mobs ahead, and tanks tanking all of the whelps and elite mobs that are being pulled in. So you're basically moving as a unit and avoiding all of the pylons. It has the potential to get quite messy if you've never done it before, but it's honestly super fun and a very unique part, and I think, something that most people remember very vividly of Blackwing Lair. Broodlord himself is a simple fight. He just casts a blast wave which drops aggro on the top threat target, and you just have multiple tanks that are kind of fighting for top aggro. That's pretty much it. It's just a tank healing fight for the most part, but the Suppression Room is definitely the unique part, and he's kind of like the end boss of the Suppression Room in a sense. Alright, so moving into AQ40, we have a good amount of fights that I felt definitely needed to be on this list. First, we've got Viscidus. The entire raid has to be decked with tons of nature resist gear in order to deal with the poison debuff and the poison pools that spawn all over the ground throughout the fight. What was really interesting though was the freeze mechanic. Viscidus had to take a certain number of individual frost hits in order to trigger his freeze mechanic. So you'd have warlocks with frost damage wands, healers with frost damage wands, and mages either wanding with a frost wand or spamming rank 1 frost bolts to freeze the boss. Then, once the boss was frozen, the entire raid would collapse onto him and melee swing to trigger the next effect, which was shatter. So you'd have to have everyone come in and trigger a certain amount of melee hits onto the boss in order to shatter him. So once the boss was shattered, he would split into a bunch of different oozlings in a circle around the room that would all rush towards the center of the room. The idea was to kill as many of the little oozlings as possible before they formed in the middle and merged together to form Viscidus again. How many of these oozlings that you would kill would dictate exactly how much damage Viscidus would take. So that was the only way to actually damage the boss. He didn't actually take damage outside of that mechanic. It was a really interesting raid mechanic and probably one of my favorite fights in vanilla in general, including having to prepare for him, grinding the whole nature as a set, like the whole thing together. Next from AQ40, we've got the Twin Emperors. These Goliath Scarab Emperor warriors had a really cool fight which required really strong coordination within the raid. So Vecnalash was a melee boss who wielded a two-handed sword and needed to be tanked by a warrior tank, while Veclor, his brother, was a caster who needed to be range tanked by a warlock casting Searing Pain, which was a scorch-like spell which dealt higher threat. The warlock would need a high stamina tanking set as well, with a bunch of health consumables to tank this fight. Where the coordination comes in is the bosses switch places periodically throughout the fight. They teleport into each other's positions. So you need 2 tanks on each side, 1 warlock and 1 warrior on each side. When Veclor comes onto your side, the warlock on that side needs to immediately pick him up because aggro actually resets every time they switch, and when Vecnalash goes on the other side, the warrior needs to immediately pick it up. Veclor casts a super strong AoE spell, so melees can only realistically be on Vecnalash. This means that every single time the bosses switch places, the melee group will end up trekking over to the other side and getting on Vecnalash. If the bosses come too close to each other and the aggro transition isn't done smoothly, the bosses heal up extremely fast. So when the bosses teleport and switch places, they need to be seamlessly picked up every single time without error. There's also bugs all over the room, which can become enraged from a spell from Vecnalash, and they need to be dealt with immediately when they become enraged, alongside with blizzards that are casted by Veclor, and he explodes bugs every now and then, so he'll detonate a bomb on one of the bugs and it'll eventually explode. Overall, it's a mechanic heavy fight with tons of coordination needed to execute the tank switching flawlessly. It's a really awesome fight, however, and I can't wait for AQ40 to tackle these twin Goliaths. Last one in AQ40, we've got Cthulhu, the last boss and old god himself. Cthulhu was one of the hardest bosses in Classic. When he first came out, he was pretty much unkillable. In fact, it was thought that he was actually mathematically unfeasible at the time. Ian Hazekostas, who's a lead game designer at Blizzard right now, was actually an Elitist Jerks raid member back then, and he crunched the numbers and came out with a report that stated that Cthulhu was mathematically impossible to kill. After this report, Blizzard patched it, and quickly thereafter Cthulhu went down. So this fight is one of the most awesome fights that I've ever done in my time playing Classic. It has two phases. The first phase is the Eye of Cthulhu phase. This phase requires really strong raid coordination, especially between 40 raid members. Cthulhu has this chain lightning ability that targets one raid member and chains to the next raid member within 8 to 10 yard radius, endlessly chaining as long as there's someone within range for the next hit. So each raid member needs to find a spot around the room while being spread apart from each other member by 10 yards. The room is pretty small, so you really need to coordinate almost like back in elementary school gym class where you spread your arms around and separate from each other arm distance and then do jumping jacks, except it's even more complicated because of this. Each group has a predetermined section in the room, so one group here, and one group here, so on and so forth until you cover the whole circular room. Every now and then, the boss will cast Dark Glare, which is a massive laser beam ability that spins around in a circle around the room. If you get caught in it, you die, no questions asked. Why is this annoying? Because it actually shifts the entire raid into a completely different spot since you're running in a circular motion away from the I-beam. You then need to spread out again, grouping group by group, but in a different orientation around the room because the whole raid has been shifted around by the I-beam. You basically need Chinese-style crowd coordination for this stuff. It's pretty intense, and it takes a while to feel it out all properly with your raid group. All of this is going on, while tentacles and eyeballs and massive adds are spawning out of the ground and need to be nuked or counterspelled or interrupted immediately. When you enter phase 2, Cthulhu comes out, he's armored and basically takes no damage at all, and the focus on this phase is just to kill all of the tentacles and interrupt all of the tentacles around. Periodically, someone will get swallowed up, and it'll put them into Cthulhu's stomach where they're taking periodic damage from his belly acid. When you're in the stomach, you need to kill the tentacle within his stomach. When the tentacle dies, Cthulhu is weakened for 45 seconds and you may do damage to him. Rinse and repeat until he dies. It's a really complex fight with so much going on, really legendary encounter, and it takes like 15 to 18 minutes to kill. Now to Nax, the gem of vanilla. Let's get into some bosses that I chose from this raid. So first we've got Heigan. Heigan is a super iconic raid fight. The room floor has this cracked fell magic look to it, and the boss stands on his platform above that floor. The main tank needs to pull the boss down to the cracked floor, and all of the mana users need to immediately get up to the platform because Heigan drains mana if you're in close range to him. So the tank and melee group will stay down with Heigan at the bottom floor, and the range group will all stay at the platform at the back at max range. Next is when things get interesting. The cracked floor has 4 quadrants to it, which blasts a pulse of fellfire with one safe spot that keeps moving throughout each quadrant. The tank and the melee group have to move with the boss into that safe quadrant every single time as the fire is pulsing, into that safe zone over and over again, and basically execute on what we call the Heigan dance, where they move from quadrant to quadrant, avoiding the flame pulse by getting in that safe zone over and over again. Phase 2, Heigan teleports up to his platform and the whole raid has to do the dance for an extended period of time. Then rinse and repeat, rinse and repeat. It's just an awesome fight visually, it's super fun to execute, and it's got its own name which is called the Heigan dance, which is awesome. It's definitely a fight that seems to stick in my mind over all these years, pretty much more than any other fight I think in vanilla in a certain way, and it's just iconic. Next in Nax we've got Gluth. This fight is one that really sticks out to me mainly because of the zombie horde. So as the fight progresses, masses of zombies will spawn at one end of the boss room. It's a hunter and mage's job primarily to gather up all of the zombies and kite them until the boss casts this ability called Devastate. Devastate reduces everybody's HP to 5%, including the zombies. So you need to kite and gather all of the zombies until Devastate is casted, then once Devastate goes off, nuke all of the zombies as they start to rush to Gluth. Once that Devastate hits, they're all going to start running to Gluth, and if a zombie reaches Gluth, they're going to start healing him up. It's just a really awesome fight, and I think especially when you're dealing with the actual zombies yourself, which has always been my job in the past to deal with them, I think that's probably why I like this fight so much. It was probably what I looked forward to the most when I was headed to Nax, and it's just a mechanic that I've always really liked. Gluth also has a fear and a healing debuff, which is mainly something that the main tank has to deal with, but in general it's all about that zombie chow. Okay, now last on the list, and certainly not least, it's one of the most epic raid encounters I think I've experienced in the game, not necessarily only in the expansion. We've got the Four Horsemen. Not only does this boss fight drop the corrupted Ashbringer, but this encounter happens to be one of the most coordination intense and longest raid encounters I think probably in the game's history. So you have 4 horse riders. Each needs to be split up and tanked individually in one corner of the room. I won't go into too much detail about all the little minutia of the fight because I mean that would literally take me over 10 minutes to explain, but basically you need 8 tanks and the raid is split up into 4 groups, 1 horseman per group essentially. And each horseman has a special ability like a meteor that needs to be soaked between all the members of a group, or a chain holy, like a chain lightning holy spell that needs to be outranged. And each horseman also has a mark. So the mark is a stacking debuff that applies to anyone within range of 1 horseman, and each horseman has a different mark. The mark is a stacking debuff that applies to anyone in range. So essentially, you have people constantly swapping from horseman to horseman, going to the safe zone and drop stacks and bandage up, group swapping places to keep the stacks in check, tank swapping in the process, and that's why you need 8 tanks. You'll have 1 tank that'll take as many marks as he can handle, then another tank will come and take the boss off of him, and then the other tank will go to the safe zone or then go to the next horseman. So it's like a totally insane, like, coordination heavy fight. And there's also void zones that are constantly spawning on the ground, and if you stand in them you die. It's hard to explain, but essentially you have 1 horseman in each corner, and groups and players are constantly just rotating in and out between different horsemen and coordinating in a tactical manner to deal with the mechanics. When I did this fight back in 2014, it would essentially take on average 20 minutes to kill this boss. 20 minutes of absolute coordination between 8 different tanks and a 40-man raid in general, you know, cycling people and communicating as to who's going where and who's doing what. One mistake and it's over. I to this day feel this boss is the holy grail of raid encounters in vanilla and maybe in the entire game in general. And when Nax is right around the corner, I'll be making a guide probably for this boss encounter for sure. Okay guys, that's it for this one. I know there's gonna be a good amount of people in the comment section saying, how could you not include Kel'Thuzad? You know, how could you not include Gothic and all kinds of other bosses? But these are just the ones that really stuck out to me on a personal level. I mean, it's my video after all, so this is what you get. Hopefully you guys liked the video. You know, it was a pretty intense one to work on. My throat's killing me right now, but it was fun to go over some of my favorite unique encounters for sure. And if you guys want to see more content like this in the future, consider supporting me on Streamlabs, you know, with a nice little tip. Anything is really appreciated. Leave a like, comment, subscribe, of course, you know the drill, soldiers. Thanks for watching. Have a good one. Peace.